The wind didn't just howl that night. It screamed like a dying man. Up on Blackwood Ridge, where the Montana sky turns into a graveyard of clouds, Silas Mercer found something that would change the course of history, or at least the history of a few lost souls. He didn't find gold, and he didn't find glory. He found a grave that wasn't quite finished yet, a collapsed cabin, a woman buried under timber and mud, and the faint, impossible cry of a baby. They say a man can't fight the mountain and win, but Silas didn't care about winning. He just cared about breathing. What he dug out of that wreckage wasn't just a survivor. It was a secret that half the territory would kill to keep buried. This is the true story of the rescue at Deadman's Drop. The winter of 1888 was known in the territories as the Great White Death. But for Silas Mercer, the cold was just another thing trying to kill him. He was a man of 35 hard years, with hands that looked like they were carved from hickory and a face that rarely offered a smile. He was a drift rider, checking fence lines for the Bar K outfit along the treacherous spine of Blackwood Ridge. It was late afternoon when the storm broke for a brief, deceptive moment of calm. The silence was louder than the wind. Silas pulled his coat tighter. His horse, a roan named Buster, stepping high through the drifts. That's when he saw it, or rather, saw what wasn't there. The old trapper's cabin that stood near the creek bed was gone. In its place was a chaotic scar of earth, timber, and snow. A massive cornice of snow had given way above, triggering a slide that smashed the structure flat. It looked like a giant fist had simply punched the cabin into the earth. Silas spurred Buster forward, the horse fighting the deep powder. "Easy, boy," Silas grunted, sliding out of the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. He waded toward the wreckage. It was quiet. Too quiet. A pile of splintered pine logs jutted out of the snow like broken ribs. He was about to turn back. No one could survive that when he heard it. It was a sound so faint he thought the wind was playing tricks on his tired mind. A mewling, like a kitten, or a child. Silas froze. He tore his gloves off, ignoring the bite of the freezing air, and fell to his knees. "Hello," he roared, his voice cracking. "Is anyone there?" Silence. Then, a muffled thump from beneath a crisscross of heavy beams. Adrenaline, sharp and hot, flooded his veins. He didn't have a shovel. He didn't have a pick. He grabbed the jagged end of a shattered roof beam and heaved. It didn't budge. He shifted his grip, his boots slipping on the ice, and roared with the effort. Veins bulging in his neck. The timber groaned and shifted 3 inches. It was enough. He began to dig. He dug with the ferocity of a badger, his fingers hooking into the frozen mud and ice, tearing it away in chunks. His fingernails tore. His knuckles bled. He didn't feel it. He dug until the snow turned pink with his own blood. 10 minutes. That's all he had before the sun dipped, and the temperature plummeted to 20 below. He hit fabric. Wool. Blue wool. "Hold on," he yelled, his breath pluming like dragon smoke. He frantically cleared the debris, revealing a shoulder, then a head. It was a woman. Her face was pale as the snow. Her lips blue. Her eyes were closed. But it was the way she was positioned that stopped Silas's heart. She was curled into a ball, her body acting as a human shield, arched over something tucked deep into her chest. Silas reached down, checking for a pulse at her neck. It was there, thready, weak, fluttering like a trapped moth. "I've got you," he whispered. He had to get them out, but her leg was pinned under the main support beam. It was a log thick enough to hold up a barn. Silas looked around. He couldn't lift it alone. He grabbed his lasso from his saddle, tied one end around the beam, and the other to his saddle horn. "Pull, Buster." "Ha!" The horse strained, hooves churning the snow. The rope sang tight. The beam shifted, groaning, lifting just enough. Silas threw his body into the gap, wedging his shoulder under the wood to hold it, screaming at the woman. "Now! I'm moving you now!" She didn't wake, but he grabbed her coat and dragged. The weight of the beam was crushing him, compressing his spine, squeezing the air from his lungs. With one final, agonized heave. He pulled her free and let the beam slam back down into the mud, narrowly missing his own boot. He collapsed next to her, gasping, staring at the gray sky. But the silence returned. He sat up and looked at the bundle in her arms. He peeled back the frozen edge of the woman's shawl. Two eyes, wide and terrified, stared back at him. A baby, no more than 6 months old, wrapped in layers of flannel and rabbit fur. The child was silent, shock having stolen its cry. Silas Mercer, a man who hadn't held a child since his brother died in '74, reached out a trembling, bloody hand and touched the baby's cheek. It was warm. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. But the woman wasn't moving, and the storm was coming back. Getting them onto the horse was a puzzle of leverage and desperation. The woman he found a name stitched into the handkerchief in her pocket. Clara was dead weight. Silas wrapped the baby, whom he temporarily dubbed Little Bit, inside his own heavy sheepskin coat, strapping the child to his chest. He then hoisted Clara over the front of the saddle. The ride to his line shack was 3 miles of hell. The wind returned with a vengeance, driving ice crystals into Silas's eyes. He walked alongside the horse, leading Buster, using his own body to break the wind for the unconscious woman and the baby against his heart. His line shack wasn't much a 10x, 10 box of rough-hewn logs with a stone fireplace and a dirt floor, but it was dry. He kicked the door open and carried Clara inside, laying her on his bunk. For the next 6 hours, Silas Mercer became a nursemaid. He stoked the fire until the iron stove glowed cherry red. He melted snow for water. He found a tin of condensed milk and, using a clean rag dipped in the warm liquid, managed to get the baby to suckle. The boy, it was a boy, finally let out a wail that shook the soot from the rafters. "That's it, little man," Silas murmured, rocking him awkwardly. "You tell him." Clara was harder. She had a nasty gash on her forehead, and her left leg was purple and swollen, though not broken. He stripped off her frozen, wet outer layers strictly for survival, averting his eyes with a gentleman's rigidity, and wrapped her in his dry wool blankets. He heated stones in the fire, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them at her feet and sides. He sat in the chair by the fire, the baby finally asleep in a crate lined with hay, his Winchester rifle resting across his knees. He watched her face. She was beautiful, in a sharp, haunted sort of way. High cheekbones, dark hair matted with blood and mud. She didn't look like a homesteader's wife. Her hands were calloused, yes, but her boots, they were fine leather. "City leather." Around midnight, she gasped. Silas leaned forward. "Easy. You're safe." Her eyes snapped open. They were green, the color of river moss, and filled with a frantic terror. She bolted upright, ignoring her injuries, her hands clawing at her chest. "Toby, where is?" "He's here," Silas said softly, pointing to the crate. "He's sleeping. He's fed. He's warm." She froze, staring at the crate, then at Silas. She saw the blood on his hands, her blood, his blood. She saw the rough cabin, the rifle. She slumped back, wincing as pain shot through her leg. "Who are you?" she rasped. "Name's Silas. Silas Mercer. Found you under the cabin at the ridge, pulled you out." She stared at him, analyzing him with a gaze that felt like a physical pat-down. "The cabin it fell? Avalanche took it. You were buried." She closed her eyes, a tear tracking through the dirt on her cheek. "We stopped to rest. Just for an hour. The snow was so heavy, you shouldn't have been up on that ridge, ma'am. Not in this weather. That's a goat trail, not a road." She looked away, toward the dark window. The road wasn't safe. Silas didn't miss the inflection. The road wasn't safe. Not the weather wasn't safe. The road. "Who are you running from, Clara?" Silas asked. He didn't sugarcoat it. Men like Silas didn't have time for riddles. She stiffened. Her hand went instinctively to her throat, where a silver locket hung. "My name is Clara O'Malley, and I'm not running from anyone. I'm traveling to Helena. Helena is 100 miles east. You are heading west, toward the passes. toward the nothing. She glared at him, a spark of fire returning. "If you saved me just to interrogate me, Mr. Mercer, you wasted your time. I have money. I can pay you for your trouble." Silas stood up, his joints popping. He walked over to the stove and poured a cup of black coffee. He handed it to her. "I don't want your money, Mrs. O'Malley, but if you're heading west into the Bitterroots with a baby in winter, you're running. And up here, what you run from usually follows. If I'm housing you, I need to know if I need to keep this rifle loaded." Clara took the coffee, her hands shaking. She looked at the baby, then back at Silas. The defiance crumbled, replaced by a deep, exhausting fear. "His name is Toby," she whispered. "And they will come. If they find out I'm alive, they will come." "Who?" "His father's men," she said, her voice trembling. "And the man who killed his father." Silas looked at the woman, really looked at her. He saw the desperation of a mother wolf. He nodded slowly. "Let 'em come," he said, turning back to the fire. Roads drifted in. "Nobody's getting up here for 3 days. You rest." But Silas knew that was a lie. If men were desperate enough, snow wouldn't stop them. He checked the action on his Winchester again. It was going to be a long night. Morning broke over the ridge like a bruised plum, the light filtering through the oiled paper of the shack's single window in shades of gray and purple. The storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving the world buried under 4 feet of fresh powder. Silence reigned outside, the kind of heavy, absolute silence that usually precedes a gunshot. Inside the shack, the air was thick with the smell of pine pitch and stale coffee. Silas Mercer hadn't slept. He sat in the same wooden chair, his body angled toward the door, his Winchester resting across his thighs like a favorite child. He had spent the night listening to the wind and the shallow, pained breathing of the woman in his bunk. Clara O'Malley was awake now. She sat propped up against the rough-hewn log wall, the baby, Toby, nursing quietly at her breast. The firelight caught the sharp angles of her face, stripped of the mud and blood. She was younger than Silas had first thought, maybe 24, but her eyes were old. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the curtain pulled back on the world and didn't like what was behind it. "You have questions," Clara said. Her voice was stronger today, though rasped by the dry mountain air. Silas took a sip of cold coffee. "I have a lot of things, Mrs. O'Malley. Questions are the least useful of them. I'd prefer answers." She adjusted the blanket around Toby. "His name was Patrick. My husband. He was a surveyor for the Union Pacific, or so he told the company. In truth, he was looking for something else." Silas didn't interrupt. He pulled a whetstone from his pocket and began to rhythmically run it along the blade of his hunting knife. "Shh, shh, shh." "Patrick found water," she continued, her gaze drifting to the flames. "Not just a creek or a spring. He found the aquifer that feeds the entire Sweetwater Valley. He mapped the underground flow, in a territory fighting over every drop. That map is worth more than gold. It's worth a kingdom." Silas paused the knife. "Water rights," he muttered. "Men kill for less in Montana." "A man named Josiah Sterling wants to build a dam," Clara said, spitting the name out like a curse. "He wants to choke the valley, starve the homesteaders out, and buy the land for pennies on the dollar. He calls it progress. Patrick called it theft. Patrick filed the claim on the source personally, under his name, to protect the valley. And Patrick is dead," Silas finished. Clara flinched, but she nodded. 3 days ago, in our home in Bozeman. They came in the night, men with badges that didn't shine quite right. Patrick held them off at the door. He screamed for me to run, to take the papers and run. She tapped the thick woolen bodice of her dress. "I have the deed and the geological survey here. Sterling can't build his dam without the land, and he can't claim the land without these papers." Silas stood up and walked to the window. He scraped a peephole in the frost with his fingernail. The valley below was a blinding sheet of white. "Josiah Sterling," Silas mused. "I know the name. He owns the copper smelter in Butte. He owns the sheriff in 3 counties. And he hires men who don't worry about the law. The man leading them, Clara whispered, a tremor entering her voice. He's distinct. He wears a long duster coat, gray like a wolf, and he has a scar that runs through his eyebrow. Silas went rigid. The air in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. He turned slowly to face her. A scar on the left side? Through a milky eye? Clara nodded, her eyes widening. You know him? Caleb Rourke, Silas said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He ain't a sheriff. He's a bounty hunter who turned into a hired killer when the bounties got too small. I rode with him, 10 years back, down in Arizona. Before I knew what kind of man he was, Silas walked back to the table and slammed the knife into the wood. If Rourke is tracking you, the snow won't stop him. He tracks like a bloodhound. He doesn't look for tracks. He looks for intent. He knows where you're going before you do. I was trying to get to my brother in Seattle, Clara said. We took the mountain pass to avoid the main roads, and you ended up in a grave, Silas said bluntly. Rourke will figure that out. He'll see the slide. He'll see the horse tracks leading away from it. He's coming, Clara. What do we do? She asked, clutching Toby tighter. Silas looked around the small shack. It was a trap. One way in, one way out. If Rourke brought men, they could burn them out in an hour. But moving her now, with that leg, was suicide. We wait, Silas said. But we don't wait to die. We get ready. He spent the next 2 hours. He checked his ammunition, 40 rounds for the Winchester, 12 for his Colt Peacemaker. Not enough for a war, but enough for a fight. He then went to the loose floorboard in the corner, the one under his bunk. He pried it up. Underneath, wrapped in an oilskin cloth, was a box of dynamite, leftover from when he'd had to clear a stump the previous summer. 3 sticks. Can you shoot? Silas asked, tossing a heavy revolver onto the blankets beside her. It was a Schofield, a break-top heavy hitter. Clara picked it up. Her hands were small, but she checked the cylinder with a practiced thumb. Patrick taught me. I can hit a can at 20 paces. Good. If they come through that door, you don't aim for the head. It's a small target. You aim for the gut. You put them down. The reality of it settled over Clara. She wasn't just a widow running away anymore. She was a soldier in a war she hadn't started. She looked at Silas, this stranger who had dug her out of the earth with his bare hands. Why are you doing this? She asked softly. You could walk away. Leave us. Rourke wouldn't care about you. Silas looked at his hands, the knuckles still scabbed and raw from digging through the timber. He thought about the brother he'd lost in the blizzard of '74, the one he hadn't reached in time. The ghost that rode behind him, every day. I dug you out. Mrs. O'Malley, Silas said, his voice low and gravelly. That makes you my responsibility. And I don't leave a job half-finished. He walked to the door and cracked it open. The sun was high now, blindingly bright. And there, on the wind, he heard it. Not the howl of a wolf, but the sharp, metallic clink of a shod hoof striking granite. Silas closed the door and barred it with a heavy log. Wake the baby, he said, his voice flat. Feed him now, because in 10 minutes, it's going to get very loud. The waiting was always the worst part. It was the silence before the thunder, the tightening of the chest that made every breath feel like inhaling broken glass. Silas stood by the window, his rifle barrel resting on the sill, watching the tree line 300 yards down the slope. First came the steam. The huffing breath of horses worked hard in deep snow. Then, the shapes emerged from the pines. 3 riders. They moved slowly, methodically. They weren't riding abreast. They were spread out. A tactical formation to minimize targets. Silas brought the Winchester's sights up. He adjusted for the drop and the wind. The lead rider was big, wrapped in a buffalo coat. The one on the left was wiry, nervous-looking. But the one in the middle, he wore a gray duster that hung almost to his spurs. Even at this distance, Silas recognized the slouch in the saddle. Caleb Rourke. They found the tracks, Silas said over his shoulder. 3 of them. Clara was huddled behind the overturned table, the Schofield in her hand. Toby swaddled tight and placed in the safest corner, shielded by the iron stove. Is it him? It's him. The riders stopped about 50 yards out. Rourke raised a hand, and the other two halted. He sat there for a long moment, studying the shack. He knew. Rourke always knew. Mercer! Rourke's voice carried effortlessly across the snow, crisp and jovial, like a neighbor calling over a fence. I know that's your horse in the lean-to. That roan has a distinct gait. Silas didn't answer. He kept the bead of his rifle on Rourke's chest. I ain't got no quarrel with you, Silas, Rourke yelled. I'm looking for a woman. A thief. She stole from Mr. Sterling. Bad business. I just want to return the property. Silas cracked the window open just an inch. No thieves here, Caleb. Just me and the winter. Turn around. Rourke laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound. Now, Silas, I saw the slide. I saw the drag marks. You're a good man. A savior. I respect that, but you're interfering with commerce. And you know how I get when I'm frustrated. I know how you get, Silas shouted back. That's why my rifle is aimed at your heart. Rourke sighed, theatrical and exaggerated. He turned to the big man in the buffalo coat. He's stubborn. Always was. Then, the world exploded. Rourke didn't draw a gun. He dropped from his saddle into the snow just as the man in the buffalo coat raised a Sharps buffalo rifle and fired. The heavy slug punched through the log wall of the shack a foot to the left of Silas's head, sending a shower of splinters into his cheek. The sound was deafening in the small space. Silas returned fire instantly. Crack thoom. His shot took the big man in the shoulder, knocking him backward off his horse. The horse reared, screaming, and bolted. Get down, Silas roared at Clara. Bullets began to rain on the shack. The wiry man and Rourke had taken cover behind a cluster of boulders and were pouring fire into the windows and door. The wood splintered and groaned. A lantern shattered, dousing the floor in oil. Silas moved. He didn't stay at the window. He scrambled low across the floor, sliding to a chink in the logs near the fireplace. He waited for a rhythm. Bang, bang. Pause. He popped up, fired 2 rounds in quick succession at the boulder, and ducked back down as stone chips flew where he had just been. They're pinning us, Silas yelled. They're going to flank. He was right. Rourke was keeping up a steady suppression fire, keeping Silas's head down, while the wiry man who moved like a coyote was scrambling through the snow toward the blind side of the shack. Silas looked at the dynamite in his pocket. He looked at the stove. Clara, he said, crawling over to her. I need you to cover the door. If Rourke tries to rush, you shoot. Don't hesitate. Where are you going? She cried, her eyes wide with panic. I'm going to discourage them. Silas grabbed a lit piece of kindling from the stove. He crawled to the back wall, where a small ventilation hatch for the root cellar was located. He kicked the latch open. He could see the boots of the wiry man crunching through the snow, coming around the corner, a torch in his hand. They were going to burn the shack down. Silas lit the fuse on one stick of dynamite. It hissed angrily. He counted to 3. 1, 2, 3. He tossed the stick out the hatch, aiming for a snowbank 5 feet away from the approaching man. Fire in the hole, Silas muttered, covering his head. The explosion shook the mountain. The ground heaved. The wiry man didn't scream. He was simply lifted off his feet by the concussion and thrown 20 feet back into a snowdrift. The torch extinguished instantly. Silence returned, ringing in their ears. Silas! Rourke's voice was no longer jovial. It was jagged with rage. You throw dynamite at me? That's ungentlemanly. I'm fresh out of manners, Caleb, Silas yelled, scrambling back to the front window. He looked out. The big man was groaning in the snow, clutching his shoulder. The wiry man was dazed, stumbling away. Rourke was still behind the rock, but he was exposed. Silas leveled the Winchester. He had the shot. He could end it. He squeezed the trigger. Click. A misfire. A bad primer. Of all the times, Silas cursed and racked the lever, ejecting the dud cartridge. but the moment was gone. Rourke had vaulted onto his horse, grabbing the reins of the wiry man's mount. He swooped down, grabbing the dazed man by the collar, and dragged him up. "This ain't over, Mercer," Rourke screamed, wheeling his horse. "I'm bringing the posse. I'm bringing hell." They galloped off, leaving the wounded big man in the snow. Silas didn't watch them go. He slumped against the wall, his chest heaving. His cheek was bleeding freely now. "Are they gone?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "For now," Silas said. He stood up, his legs feeling like jelly. He looked at the wounded man outside, who was trying to crawl toward his rifle. Silas stepped out the door, walked over, and kicked the rifle away. The man looked up, eyes full of pain. "Help me," he wheezed. "I'll bind your wound," Silas said coldly. "Then I'm tying you to a tree. If your friends come back, maybe they'll cut you down." He turned back to the shack. The door was hanging off one hinge. The roof was leaking snow where a bullet had pierced the shingles. It was no longer a shelter. It was a cage. "Pack everything," Silas told Clara as he walked back inside. "We have to leave." "Leave? To where?" Clara asked, standing up and rocking the crying baby. "There's nowhere to go." Silas looked at the map in his mind. The pass was blocked. The valley was controlled by Sterling. Rourke would be back in hours with 10 men. "We're not going to a town," Silas said, grabbing his saddlebags. "There's an old mining tunnel, 3 miles east, called the Devil's Throat. It cuts through the mountain. It comes out on the other side of the ridge, near the rail line." "The Devil's Throat?" Clara asked. "It sounds safe." "It's abandoned for a reason," Silas said grimly. "It's unstable, filled with gas. But it's the only way off this rock that Rourke won't expect us to take." He looked at Toby, then at Clara. "If we stay here, we die. If we go into the tunnel, we might die. That's the choice." Clara set her jaw. She grabbed her bag. "Then let's go." Silas nodded. He had found them in a grave, and now he was leading them into another one. But this time, he was going in with his eyes open. The journey to the mine entrance was a blur of white agony. Silas led the horse, Buster, by the bridle, forcing the animal through drifts that reached its chest. Clara rode, clutching Toby so tight her knuckles were white, her eyes scanning the tree line for movement. Every snapping branch sounded like a rifle shot. Every shadow looked like a man in a gray duster. They reached the maw of the Devil's Throat just as the sun began to bleed behind the peaks, painting the snow in violent shades of crimson. The entrance was a gaping wound in the side of the mountain, framed by rotting timbers that looked like jagged teeth. A sign, faded and bullet-riddled, hung crookedly from a beam. "Danger. No entry. Black powder gas." "This is it?" Clara asked, her voice thin. The wind howled around the opening, creating a low, mournful whistle that seemed to come from the earth's own lungs. "It's the only way through the ridge without climbing over the summit," Silas said, pulling the heavy boards off the entrance. "The tunnel runs 3 miles straight through the rock. It comes out near the old silver processing plant on the other side. From there, we can flag a train." He lit a kerosene lantern. The flame sputtered, then caught, casting a sickly yellow glow that barely penetrated the gloom. "Stay close, and whatever you do, don't touch the supports. This mountain is just looking for an excuse to fall down." They stepped inside. The temperature rose immediately, shifting from the biting cold of the blizzard to a damp, stagnant chill that seeped into the bones. The air smelled of sulfur, wet earth, and something ancient, the smell of stone that hadn't seen the sun in a decade. For the first mile, the only sound was the crunch of their boots on the gravel and the rhythmic clop of Buster's hooves. The tunnel was narrow, the rock walls glistening with moisture. Occasionally, they passed side tunnels, black mouths that breathed cold drafts, but Silas kept them on the main track, following the rusted iron rails that disappeared into the dark. They stopped to rest near an old pumping station. Silas checked the flame of the lantern. It was burning steady, but the color was shifting slightly toward blue. "Methane," he muttered. "Not enough to kill us yet, but enough to make me nervous about shooting that gun. Clara sat on a dusty crate, feeding Toby. The baby was remarkably calm, his eyes wide, reflecting the lantern light. "You said you knew this place," Clara said, her voice echoing softly. "How?" Silas leaned against a support beam, his face in shadow. "My brother, Elias. He worked this mine in '80. He was a powder monkey. Set charges." Silas paused, looking down at his hands. "He told me about the layout. He said the devil's throat had a heartbeat. Said you could hear it if you listened close enough. What happened to him?" Clara asked gently. "It wasn't the mine that killed him," Silas said, his voice hard. "It was the winter of '74. We were out trapping. A storm hit, worse than this one. Elias broke his leg. I left him to get help. I thought I could make it to the outpost and back in 4 hours. The snow was too deep. I got lost. By the time I found him 2 days later, he didn't finish. He didn't have to." The silence in the tunnel grew heavy, weighted with the ghosts of his past. "You blame yourself," Clara said. "It wasn't a question. A man is responsible for who he walks with," Silas said, looking up. His eyes met hers, fierce and guarded. "I left him behind. I swore I'd never leave anyone behind again. Not in the snow, not in the dark." Clara reached out, placing a hand on his arm. The contact was startling in the cold. "You didn't leave us, Silas. You dug us out. You're here now." For a moment, the hardened shell of the drifter cracked. He looked at Clara not as a burden, not as a job, but as a woman who saw him. Then, Buster whinnied. The horse's ears pinned back, and he stomped a hoof nervously. Silas stiffened. He blew out the lantern instantly, plunging them into absolute darkness. "Quiet," he hissed. Clara froze, clutching Toby. From far behind them, back toward the entrance, came a sound. It wasn't the wind. It was the scrape of metal on stone. Then, a voice, distorted by the tunnel's acoustics, drifting like smoke. "Come out. Come out. Wherever you are." Rourke. He hadn't waited for the posse. He had followed them in alone. "He's tracking us by the echo," Silas whispered, his lips close to Clara's ear. "He can hear the horse. We have to move. Now." They moved blindly, Silas leading Buster by touch, keeping one hand on the tunnel wall. The darkness was suffocating. Every breath felt loud. Every footstep felt like a thunderclap. They were walking into the belly of the beast, and the beast was waking up. They hurried deeper, the air growing thinner, the smell of sulfur stronger. The tunnel began to slope downward. Silas knew they were nearing the cathedral, a massive central chamber where the main veins of silver had once intersected. It was unstable, held up by a forest of rotting timber supports. "Silas," Clara whispered, panic rising in her voice. "I see light." She was right. Behind them, a faint, dancing orange glow was bouncing off the wet walls. Rourke had a torch, and he was moving fast. "He's gaining," Silas said. "He's not worried about the gas. He's crazy." They burst into the cathedral. It was a cavernous space, the roof lost in shadow 50 feet above. The rails split here, branching off into a dozen directions. In the center was a deep, vertical shaft, a winze dropping down into the lower levels, spanned by a narrow wooden trestle bridge. "Across the bridge," Silas ordered. "Get to the other side." Clara rushed onto the rotting wood. The bridge creaked ominously under her weight. Buster balked, refusing to step onto the planks. "Go," Silas yelled, slapping the horse's rump. The horse bolted not across the bridge, but sideways, down one of the side tunnels, its hooves clattering loudly. "Buster!" Silas shouted, but it was too late. The horse was gone. "There you are." The voice boomed from the tunnel entrance they had just exited. Rourke stepped into the cathedral, the torch in one hand, his Schofield revolver in the other. The light illuminated his face twisted, smiling, the scar through his eye looking like a crack in a porcelain doll. "End of the line! Mercer!" Rourke shouted. He raised his gun. Silas dove behind an ore cart just as Rourke fired. The bullet sparked off the iron wheel, whining into the darkness. "Clara, get down!" Silas roared. Clara was halfway across the bridge, exposed. She dropped to her knees, shielding Toby with her body. "You can't hide, Silas." Rourke laughed, walking slowly into the chamber. "I can see the lady. I can see the brat. Give me the papers, Clara, and I'll make it quick. I'll even let Mercer walk away. What do you say?" "Go to hell, Rourke!" Clara screamed, pulling her own revolver and firing blindly. The shot went wide, hitting a support beam. "Now that's just rude," Rourke tutted. He leveled his gun at Clara. Silas saw the angle. Rourke had her dead to rights. Silas had one shot. But Rourke was behind a thick timber pillar. Silas couldn't hit him. He looked at the roof. The supports in the cathedral were old, groaning under the weight of the mountain. He looked at the bundle of dynamite still in his pocket, 2 sticks left. He didn't have a fuse long enough to throw it. He had to place it. "Clara," Silas yelled. "When I say run, you run for the far tunnel. Don't look back." "What are you doing?" she cried. Silas didn't answer. He lit the short fuse on the dynamite. It sparked, hissing violently. He stood up from behind the ore cart, fully exposed. "Hey, Rourke," Silas bellowed. Rourke turned, surprised. "Suicide, Mercer?" "I expected bet." Silas didn't shoot at Rourke. He threw the dynamite straight up. It spiraled into the darkness above the center of the chamber, right toward the main keystone of the ceiling arch. "Run!" Silas screamed, tackling Clara on the bridge and shoving her forward. Boom. The explosion wasn't just a sound, it was a physical blow. It sucked the air out of the chamber and slammed it back in a wave of pressure. Then, the mountain roared. High above, the rock fractured. The keystone shattered. A massive slab of granite, the size of a carriage, detached from the ceiling and plummeted. It smashed into the ground directly between Silas and Rourke, taking out the near side of the bridge. The impact knocked Silas off his feet, sending him sliding toward the edge of the deep shaft. He clawed at the rotting wood, his fingers splintering the planks, his legs dangling over the abyss. "Silas!" Clara screamed from the far side. She had made it across. Dust billowed in a choking cloud. Debris rained down fist-sized rocks, timber, dirt. The lantern was smashed, extinguished. The only light was Rourke's torch, lying in the rubble on the other side of the chasm. Silas pulled himself up, coughing, dust coating his throat. "I'm okay," he choked out. "I'm okay." He looked across the gap. The bridge was gone in the middle. A 20-foot chasm separated him from Rourke's side. But Silas was on the wrong side. He was stuck on the entrance side. Clara was on the exit side. "No," Silas whispered. Through the settling dust, he saw movement. Rourke, the bounty hunter, was pinned. A heavy timber had fallen across his legs, trapping him against the wall. He was alive, but he wasn't going anywhere. He was screaming, a sound of pure animal rage. "My legs! Damn you, Mercer! My legs! Silas!" Clara called out, her voice frantic. "You're on the other side. How do I get to you?" "You can't!" Silas yelled across the gap. The ceiling groaned again. Small rocks were still falling. The integrity of the cathedral was gone. It was going to come down completely. "The exit is behind you, Clara. Go." "I'm not leaving you," she sobbed. "You have to." Silas stood up, wiping blood from his eyes. "The mountain is collapsing. That tunnel behind you leads to the surface. It's the only way." "But what about you?" Silas looked around. The entrance tunnel was blocked by the cave-in. The bridge was out. Rourke was pinned but still had his gun, waving it wildly in the torchlight. "I'll find another way," Silas lied. There was no other way. "Go, Clara. Save the boy. Save the proof. Do it for Patrick. Do it for me." Clara hesitated. She looked at the dark tunnel behind her, then at Silas, standing amidst the ruin of the mine. She made a choice. She adjusted Toby in her arms, wiped her tears, and nodded. "I will come back," she promised, her voice fierce. "I will come back for you." She turned and ran into the darkness. Silas watched her go until her footsteps faded. He turned back to Rourke. The bounty hunter had stopped screaming. He was laughing now, a low, delirious sound, pointing his gun at Silas across the chasm. "Looks like we're both stuck here. Cowboy," Rourke wheezed, leveling the barrel. Silas drew his peacemaker. "Looks like." The ceiling gave another ominous crack, loud as a cannon shot. The mountain did not fall all at once. It died screaming. Inside the cathedral chamber, the air turned into a solid wall of dust. Caleb Rourke, pinned beneath the timber, fired his last shot blindly into the gloom. The bullet sparked harmlessly against the granite floor. He was laughing as the ceiling finally gave way, a manic, broken sound that was cut short by the roar of 1,000,000 tons of rock. Silas didn't look back. He couldn't. The bridge was gone. The exit tunnel behind Clara was the only path to safety, and he was on the wrong side of the chasm. The floor beneath his boots was trembling, fracturing like ice on a spring pond. He spotted a jagged fissure in the rock wall to his left. It was a ventilation drift, an ancient, narrow throat that slanted sharply downward, away from the collapse but deeper into the earth. It was suicide, but staying was a guarantee. "Sorry, Buster," Silas whispered to the memory of his horse. He dove into the fissure head first, just as the cathedral imploded. The darkness was absolute. Silas slid down the rough stone chute, tearing his clothes, skinning his elbows and knees. He tumbled for what felt like an eternity, the roar of the collapsing mine chasing him like a physical beast. Then, the angle changed. The chute dropped him into free space. He hit water. It was freezing, bone-shattering cold. It was the underground aquifer, the very water source Patrick O'Malley had died protecting. The current was violent, a subterranean river swollen by the winter melt. Silas was thrashed against the rocks, his lungs burning, the weight of his boots dragging him down. He fought, kicking wildly, his mind flashing images of the woman and the baby in the snow. "Not yet," he thought. "I promised her." He was swept through miles of black tunnels, dragged through the veins of the mountain, until finally, the river spat him out. He washed up on a gravel bank in a deep ravine, 3 miles west of the mine entrance, under a sky full of indifferent stars. He crawled onto the frozen mud, coughed up water and blood, and collapsed. 2 weeks later, Helena was a city of mud and ambition. Clara O'Malley walked into the erratic bustle of the territorial capital looking like a specter. She wore a dress she had bartered for at a railhead, but she still wore Silas's heavy sheepskin coat. Toby was strapped to her chest. She walked with a limp, but her head was high. She went straight to the land office. It was closed. She sat on the steps and waited until morning. When the clerk arrived, a balding man with ink-stained fingers, he tried to shoo her away. "No beggars, ma'am." "I am not a beggar," Clara said, her voice cutting through the morning chill. "I am Clara O'Malley, and I am here to file a claim." The clerk froze. He knew the name. Everyone knew the name. Josiah Sterling had put a bounty on a woman imposter, claiming to own the Sweetwater rights. "Mr. Sterling is the proprietor of that region now," the clerk said nervously, glancing at the door. He filed the papers regarding the abandonment of the property just yesterday. "The property was not abandoned," Clara said, slamming a heavy, water-stained leather satchel onto the counter. "The owner was murdered, and his widow is standing right here." She pulled the geological surveys and the deed from the bag. They were wrinkled, stained with snow and sweat, but the seal of the Union Pacific surveyor was unmistakable. "Get the marshal," Clara commanded, "and tell him to bring a judge. The trial of the century, they called it. Not in a courtroom, but in the crowded town hall of Helena." Josiah Sterling arrived in a carriage with velvet seats. He was a man of silk vests and soft hands, flanked by lawyers who looked like vultures. He smiled at the crowd, confident. He claimed Clara was a fraud, a hysterical woman who had stolen papers from a dead man. "This woman," Sterling bellowed to the assembly, "claims she survived the Blackwood Ridge in winter. She claims she crossed the Devil's Throat. It is a fabrication. No one survives that." Clara stood up. She didn't shout. She simply untied the bundle she had brought with her. She laid the Schofield revolver on the table. The crowd gasped. "I didn't survive alone," she said, her voice trembling with a suppressed rage. "A man named Silas Mercer saved me. He dug me out of a grave your men put me in. He fought your assassin, Caleb Rourke, in the mines. He died so I could bring these papers here." She looked Sterling in the eye. "Do not tell me what is impossible, Mr. Sterling. I have seen impossible things. I have seen a man give his life for a stranger." The marshal, a gruff veteran named Davies, picked up the gun. He inspected it. "This is a Schofield," he muttered. "Custom grip. I know this gun. Belonged to Mercer. He was a drift rider for the Bar K," the crowd murmured. The evidence was turning. The sheer grit of her story, the physical proof of the surveys, and the testimony regarding Rourke who had vanished began to weigh on the scale. But Sterling played his final card. "Sentimental stories," he sneered. "But law is paper. And I have a bill of sale signed by Patrick O'Malley 2 days before he died." He produced a document. A forgery. A good one. The judge looked conflicted. Without a witness to the contrary, the doors to the town hall groaned open. A hush fell over the room. A man stood there. He was leaning heavily on a crutch, made of a tree branch. He was gaunt, his face covered in a beard that couldn't hide the fresh, angry scars running down his cheek. He looked like a corpse that had clawed its way out of the earth. He was wet, shivering, and looked like he had walked through hell. "I'm the witness," the man rasped. Clara turned. Her hands flew to her mouth. "Silas?" Silas Mercer limped down the aisle. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. He stopped in front of Sterling. He smelled of river mud and blood. "I saw Rourke and his men at the cabin," Silas said, his voice a low growl that silenced the room. "I heard Rourke admit to the killing before the mine came down, and I saw him die screaming your name, Sterling." Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver pocket watch. He tossed it onto the judge's table. It was dented, smashed. On the back, an engraving. "To Caleb, from J.S." "I took that off his body before the water took him," Silas lied. He hadn't taken it off the body. He had found it in the saddlebags of the horse Rourke left behind before entering the mine. But the lie anchored the truth. Sterling's face went white. The gavel came down. The forgery was exposed. The rights were awarded to Clara O'Malley. Sterling was arrested before he could leave the building. But Silas didn't watch the arrest. He was looking at Clara. She ran to him, ignoring the propriety of the court, ignoring the judge. She collided with him, burying her face in his ruined coat. Silas, the man who thought he had hands only for digging graves, wrapped his arms around her and the baby she still carried. "You came back," she sobbed. "I told you," Silas whispered, resting his chin on her head. "I don't leave a job half-finished." It took 6 months for Silas to walk without the cane. It took a year for the nightmares of the mine to fade. They built the cabin not on the ridge, but in the valley, right where the aquifer bubbled up into a crystal-clear spring. They didn't build a dam. They built an irrigation system that fed 20 farms. The valley bloomed. Silas didn't go back to drift riding. He found he had a knack for farming, and a better knack for fatherhood. He raised Toby as his own, teaching him to ride before he could walk, teaching him that the land wasn't something you owned, but something you borrowed. One evening, 3 years later, Silas sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind Blackwood Ridge. The scars on his face were silver now, lines of history written on his skin. Clara sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The quiet, the drifting?" Silas looked at the boy playing in the grass, then at the woman who had saved him just as much as he had saved her. He took her hand, his calloused fingers interlacing with hers. "I was never drifting, Clara," Silas said, watching the first star appear. "I was just looking for a place to stop." He squeezed her hand. "I found it." The wind blew down from the mountains, but it didn't howl anymore. It just whispered through the wheat. A song of peace for the man who dug a life out of the cold, hard earth. The legend of Silas Mercer and Clara O'Malley isn't just a story about survival. It's a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. In a world that was often cruel and lawless, they proved that loyalty and courage were worth more than all the gold in Montana. Silas didn't just dig a woman out of the snow that day. He dug himself out of a life of isolation. They saved each other. It reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when the weight of the world is crushing down like a collapsed mine, there is always a way out if you have something or someone worth fighting for. History forgets the cowards, but it remembers the ones who stayed when the storm hit. If this story of grit, survival, and redemption touched your heart, please take a second to hit that like button. It helps these stories reach more people. Did you think Silas was going to make it out of the mine? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more incredible true-to-life tales from the Wild West, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a legend. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next trail.